Okay, this is Tim from Adept CIM Center. We have an Adept CIM Center upgraded with all new electronics for Hoey Racing, ready for shipping. The mechanicals are very much the same. What's different is this whole new electronics box on top. All the electronics are now housed under this lid rather than inside this box. We still have these items on the front, but these are now just labels. These buttons are non-functional. It's just really just to show us the directions of the axes to remind us while we're machining. But these buttons here now replace all of these down here, and naturally with the new electronics we can now run the machine off just about any PC with an Ethernet port from any version of Windows from XP up, including Vista, Windows 7 and even Windows 8.1, and even a touchscreen computer. As long as we have an Ethernet port, as we now talk to everything via a standard Ethernet cable, which can be a blue or a red cable. So that needs to be plugged into the PC, and we no longer have a dedicated card in the PC. It's just the Ethernet, and that's it. So I've got all the files I need for installation on a memory stick, which will come to you via email or a download. So I'm going to run through now all the software and settings that are required to make this machine run. So the first thing we need to do is program an IP address, a fixed static IP address, to talk to the computer and the machine. So we do this in the Windows network settings. So once you've got your PC running with an Ethernet card in there, then we need to change the adapter settings under Network and Sharing Center. We need to right click Properties, the local area connection, and we need to change the IP address, the TCP/IP version 4 address. So what we're doing is using a fixed address by changing this setting to a fixed number, which will be 10.9.9.9. We must also enter a subnet mask 255.255.255.0, and that should be all we need to do there. So we're going to press OK. If you have multiple network adapters or wireless, I'm just going to disable those and make sure that the only network that's talking is the one which I just set as a static IP address. So that's one of the first steps. Next, we're going to install the Mark III software which drives the machine. So there's an executable Mark III version 3.exe. It's fairly straightforward installation. Agree, so terms and conditions. Install to C drive Mark III, the default location, do not change that. And we need to install most of these things. We do not need a parallel port driver. And at this point, that's the only item we need to uncheck. And then we press next again, next again, and we're now installing the Mark III software which controls the mill and the lathe. So what that's done now is it's put on our C drive. We've now got a folder called Mark III. So we need to have that window open because we need to put files and so forth into there. So that was the Mark III installation. Mark III needs a license, which is included with the machine. So we need to copy the Mark I lick.dat into the Mark III folder by doing a copy paste. Let's make sure I paste that somewhere sensible at the bottom of the list. There we go. So as long as that's in that folder, then the Mark III software will work, will be unlocked and work. The full version will work. Next, we're going to copy in these two XML files. I'm just going to shift click those, so I've got both of them at once. again we're doing a copy, and then over in the Mark III folder we're doing a paste at the bottom of the list. They must reside in the Mark III folder, the root of the Mark III folder, so C drive Mark III is where I'm at. After this, we also need to install or copy across what they call brains files. The brains files is what operates all of the front panel buttons. So this is a different location. It's still in the C drive Mark III, but then there's another folder called brains. So we need to copy all of the brains that we have into the Mark III brains folder. We can do copy replace for all files, so they appear under Mark III brains. The next step after that is we're going to install the Ethernet smooth stepper driver. So when I double click this, it's automatically going to put this in the right place. It says plugin installed, and that file actually disappears off my memory stick because it's now put it into the Mark III folder plugins, and there it is there. So that's most of the settings done. Let's just take a look and see if we've got them all right. So once you install Mark III, you end up with a number of icons on the desktop. The one you only really need is the one called Mark III Loader. So I'm going to double click that, and now I've got a list of profiles. So these bottom three are just default profiles that won't work with the Adept. The two profiles that do work are the Adept Lathe and the Adept Mill. So let's just temporarily go into the Adept Mill. So again, you have to use the Mark III Loader shortcut, which comes up after you've installed Mark III, to get to this list so that you can launch either the mill or the lathe. Now, the first time you run Mark III, it says, how do you want to connect with motion control hardware plugin Sense? We must select ESS V10, so that stands for the Ethernet smooth stepper. If we leave this on normal printer port operation, there will be no communication with the machine. We're using the Ethernet smooth stepper, the ESS. It's better not to tick this because we always need to make sure that this is selected. If by some chance it gets changed, the machine won't run, so it's better just to see that every time. I've just got a firewall warning, so we need to allow access if you get that. And that firewall actually stopped the communication. Didn't allow it through the first time, but now that the firewall setting is changed, and if I launch Mark III again, it should let it through. If the firewall is blocking the communication, it may actually be better to turn off the firewall completely, which is maybe why we're getting this error. So you really need to have a dedicated PC running the machine. That way you can turn things off like the firewall to avoid any sorts of communication issues. So that's what I'm doing now. On this laptop I had the default Windows firewall turned on. I don't want that because it was blocking the communication. So we're going to try that again with the firewall turned off. And see if we can get past this error. Okay, so the address of the board in the electronics is 10.9.9.9. So I actually made a mistake. The address we need to put into the PC can't be 10.9.9.9. It has to be unique. So rather than making this 10.9.9.9, let's make it 10.9.9.8. So two problems. The firewall was one. The other problem is I used the same address as the machine. Now when we communicate, we have success. So that's the sorts of problems that might occur during your setup, and that's how we get around them. So just to go back a step, once we get a unique address in the PC, 10.9.9.8 instead of 10.9.9.9, then, and we make sure our firewall is off, then when we select the Ethernet smooth stepper, we get this communication, and we've now got successful communication with Mark III. Right, now using Mark III, there are plenty of manuals online, thousands of people using this software, but the setup is fairly unique to the Adept, so you need to follow these instructions to get it to run. But once we get to this point, you can see we've got a flashing reset button. Now that reset button will flash red, meaning the machine's inactive. Now, when you get the machine, that reset button in Mark III cannot be reset while this emergency stop is on. The other thing that must also be done, apart from releasing the emergency stop, is this reset button. This reset light must come on before you can actually activate the reset in the Mark III software. So to do that, you press and hold. Just bear in mind that a short press won't do it. You've got to press and hold so that that reset light stays solid and the emergency stop is off. If the emergency stop is on, you can't reset Mark III. It just won't happen. If the emergency stop is off, but you forget to press this reset button, we still can't reset Mark III. Nothing will happen. So we press and hold until that solid light holds, and then we know that the electronics are ready. Now we can press this reset button in Mark III and it holds. So now that we've done that, we have control of the machine, so I can use the arrow keys on the keyboard and I get machine movement left and right, front, back, and on the keyboard it's page up and page down to move the Z axes, which you can't see. Moreover, what I can also do is zero the axes X, Y, Z. I can load up a test program. So on the set of files that you will receive, I also have under Hoey Racing XYZ axis test, which will only work in mill mode. And if we load that G code up, make sure the axes are zeroed in a central location, I can press cycle start and we can run the machine. So you can see the milling machine is running, and we now have control over the machine from the front panel. So you've got an auto switch. When we're in auto mode, we're basically using this side of the panel, so we can do a feed hold, which will stop the machine at the end of the next line of code. If we do a cycle start, we start again. We can also run in single block mode so that we only run one line of code every time I press cycle start. If this is active, this will only run one line of code. I can stop the machine from here. If I flick it over to manual mode, I've now got the ability to jog using this MPG wheel. So if I'm on the x-axis, I'm now jogging in 0.1 millimeter increments. Just remember to turn this slowly and let the axis keep up. If you just spin the wheel, the axis will keep going until it's caught up. And obviously you can select X, Y or Z axes and what increment you want to use. And this is just the basics. In the Mark III software you can do quite a lot of stuff, so this is just getting you started. We can also zero each axis after instead of pressing 0 in the Mark III software, there's a button here where you can clock up and zero each axis by pushing this button. So I'm selected X, you'll see on the screen that'll zero the X. If I flick to Y, I can zero Y, and I can zero Z from the front control panel. Generally, we don't need to home the axis if we're using local coordinates, but that's sort of going to a more advanced coordinate system level, which I won't go through in any detail here. So that's the very basics. I think you guys are probably at least initially more interested in the lathe, but the mill, just to make sure the machine works, the test programs will run only in the mill. But the procedure to get into the lathe is very similar. Now that all the software is set, we simply go back to Mark III Loader. We select the lathe, the Adept Lathe E version 2.1 from the profile list. We must make sure the ESS hardware plugin is selected. It communicated successfully, and now we're in the lathe mode. Very similar. We must have our emergency stop off. We must have our reset button or reset light solid. Then and only then we can press this reset button in Mark III. In the lathe, it's quite different to the mill, so it's two different sets of controls. We go to the manual mode. Once we're in the manual mode, we're now just dealing with Z and X axes. We can use the arrow keys on the keyboard, and we can now jog the axes left to right, front to back. To get the spindle going, note that if we just press the spindle button and nothing else, nothing will happen. We must at first set a spindle speed in this box here. To do that, we click, then we type in a number, and we must press enter. If we don't press enter, the number doesn't stick. So if I just type 2500 and then click somewhere else, that number won't actually stick. It'll go back to whatever it was. So 2500 RPM, enter. And now I can come down here and press the spindle start button. And now I've got the lathe spindle going. I can stop that from the control panel, and I can also start it from the control panel. It's actually a smoother stop if we press the spindle button twice. It ramps down slowly. If you press the stop or the emergency stop, it's a sudden stop, as you know, I want it to stop now. Whereas the spindle button, one press is on, spins up, another press spins it down. The spindle can be reversed using G codes. That's a bit more advanced. So you can find instructions on that in the Mark III manual, or we can talk about it later. One other thing you might need to know at this point is that there's a hidden window. Again, you'll find this in the Mark III manual. If you press the tab key, you'll see this side window pops up. So that's done using the tab key. And the most convenient setting here is the jog rate. So at the moment it's set to 5%. If I set that to something like 50%, remembering to press enter, then my axes will jog at a much faster speed. Just keep in mind that if this is selected to manual mode, the keyboard won't work, so we have to flick that over to the left if we're not using those front panel controls. Otherwise nothing will happen when I press the keyboard. So now I'm jogging at 50%. So that's how we control jog speed manually. Naturally, all the speeds, feeds and speeds and spindle speeds can be written into the G code. But that's the very basics. The first step when you get the machine is to get these drivers installed, and at least to get the machine to move X, Y and Z, spindles, get some movement on the spindles, and then go from there.